السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. هل على الصحفيين أن يكذبوا أو أن ينتحلوا شخصيات سعيا وراء معلومة أو تقرير أو مقالة تكشف فسادا عالميا؟ وأين تكمن أخلاق مهنة الصحافة أو الصحفي أو الوسيلة الإعلامية في هذا السياق؟ الصحافة الاستقصائية وحدودها ومخاطرها والتحديات، مع الصحفي الاستقصائي كان سيلفرشتين وتجربته من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. لن تنتج إعلاما مستقلا ولا يعرف الخوف مطلقا إذا ما عشت خائفا من أن تغضب رئيسك في العمل وتسعى لاهثا لإرضائه أو إرضاء مصادر معلوماتك أو حتى الأصدقاء. هي كلمات الصحفي الاستقصائي الأمريكي كان سيلفرستين. هي مقولة اقتنع بها كان، وتطبيقها كلفه التنقل بين أكثر من صحيفة ومجلة ومواقع أخبار إلكترونية، إلا أنه لم يتخلى عن تلك القناعة. سيلفرستين الذي يصف نفسه بفأرة الحقل في عالم الصحف والمناهض لكل ما يعده توازنا زائفا في الإعلام الإخباري، عمل في صحيفة اللوس أنجلوس تايمز كصحفي استقصائي ولدى الأسوشييتد بريس في البرازيل، وكتب مقالات عدة لماذر جونز وذا نيشن وسالون وسليت ومجلة هاربرز. كما أسس عام 1993 نشرة سياسية تدعى كاونتر بانش، إلا أنه تركها عام 1996. في كانون الأول من عام 2013 وظفت مجموعة فيرست لوك ميديا سيلفرستين ككبير الصحفيين الاستقصائيين، إلا أنه ما لبث أن ترك تلك الوظيفة عام 2014. ألف العديد من الكتب ولا سيما كتاب بعنوان العالم السري للنفط عام 2014. كان يتحدث من الداخل عن عالم الصحافة الاستقصائية والسعي لكشف الفساد والمحاذير والتبعات والأساليب الملتوية وحتى الكذب للوصول إلى معلومة عن موضوع مثير وتبرير ذلك، وكيف يصف رحلته في عالم الصحافة وكثرة تنقله من وسيلة إعلامية إلى أخرى وما أسباب ذلك، وما أبرز ما كشفه في كتابه عن عالم سري للتداولات النفطية. Silverstein, veteran investigative reporter with Vice and New York Observer, and formerly with Harper's and the Los Angeles Times. Welcome to من الداخل, or from the inside, sir.
Thank you. Shukran.
You're most welcome, sir. When it comes, Ken, to exposing global corruption, investigative journalists have a lot to say and they have a very important role to play. From your perspective and your expertise, Ken, how do you define investigative journalism? What are the goals? What are the aims? And what are the limitations, the limits? What are the red lines? What are the antis? What are the threats?
Well, the first thing I would say is there are no red lines. Because if you accept red lines, then you can't be an investigative reporter. You have to go outside of your natural red lines and talk to people with, most importantly, different perspectives than your own. It's always fun to talk to people who share your beliefs, because then you have your beliefs reinforced. But it's not very interesting. What's most interesting is to talk to people who might have a slightly different cultural background, or a racial background, or a gender background, or a religious background, or a political background, because you cannot get smarter and you can't do your job as an investigative reporter unless you understand how other people think. And you often find what's very surprising is you can go in as an investigative reporter and think that the people you're writing about are your enemies, and discover that they're your friends, or at least
there are common denominators between you and them. But allow me here to ask you, how is it like, Ken, to ask others about things they don't want you asking them about? And how do you get insiders to tell you about valuable information?
Trust, I think. I always tell people...
But I mean, you travel back and forth to a lot of countries. Do the people know you to trust you, to share this valuable information?
Usually I'm introduced to people by someone who knows them.
A fixer or somebody. Yeah.
Or, yes, a fixer, possibly, or a friend. So, for example, I might have a friend in one country, maybe the United States. Often it's because I do a lot of travel. I may have a friend in London, say, or here, or in Erbil in Iraq, where I was recently.
In Kurdistan, Iraq.
Yes, Kurdistan, the Peshmerga are fighting the same fight as Hezbollah here, actually, against ISIS. But we can talk about that later. I usually know people, and they will introduce me. You can never just knock on someone's door and have them trust you. But if you're introduced by a close friend, people will talk to you. But they still have to trust you. And so what I usually will say is, look, I'm not going to record the conversation. I don't like tape recorders because I don't trust them. The battery might die or it might malfunction, and it makes you lazy as a reporter if you believe you're recording. I would rather take notes. I can read my notes afterwards, and then I can check with the person I interviewed. This is what I always say. Look, you're not comfortable yet. So here are the rules. And we never have a written contract, but people just instinctively will trust me because I've never lied to anyone under these circumstances. If you lie...
But you did lie at a certain point in time.
Look, I tell people who aren't totally comfortable with me, I'm not recording, so there's not even proof that we ever met. You're talking to me on background, deep background. Which means I'm going to write it down, I'm not recording, and I'm going to type up my notes, and I'm going to send you my notes. And if I got anything wrong, you tell me. But for right now, it's off the record. I can't use any of the material until you give me your consent and permission. And people, I sometimes will say, I will send you an email right now confirming that. And if I break my word, you can take that email and show it to my editor and I will be fired. And sometimes people ask, but not very often. Usually they just say, okay. And then I send them my notes, they read them and review them, and no one has ever said to me, that's wrong, that is false. They might say, hey, you misunderstood what I said, and that's great.
They try to edit it.
Well, if they edit it, I won't allow that. But if they say, you misunderstood and this is what happened, then I say, okay, let's...
It could be a problem of translation, especially if you are investigating a story somewhere where they don't speak English or try to transmit their ideas perfectly.
Even in English, it's hard enough, but when you're working overseas, it's especially hard because I don't understand all the cultural references. So I believe that the way that I conduct interviews is fair and honest, and everyone is happy.
Because if everyone is happy, it's not investigative journalists where you're trying to unmask something.
Well, okay, that's very true. That's a really good point. And I feel like if I write a story where no one is angry at me, then I did the job wrong. I screwed up the story. Because people come to you with stories and they think you are going to write their story. But no, you are going to write your story as you understand it, even if you get it wrong. You cannot be a stenographer for powerful people or even for unpowerful people. When I meet people here, and especially maybe Shia people initially, people affiliated with Hezbollah, I think people who know me or who knew I was coming to talk to them checked me out. And they understood I was introduced by people, so they trusted me. They knew that I wouldn't write exactly what they wanted, but that I wasn't a liar in that case. But even people on the street, I find, I've been asked over the last few days who I work for. And when I explain, I don't work for anyone, look at my old stories. Like if I'm working for the CIA or Mossad, then I'm the best secret agent ever. Because why would I write all of these things critical of Israel and the United States for 25 or 30 years? Like, that's a pretty good record. I must be really good at what I do if I'm a spy.
Right, allow us, Ken, to stop now for a short break, and then after the break we're going to talk a bit more about one of the articles
a story that you made here in Lebanon that made you lose your job at the LA Times.
Okay.
Right?
Great.
إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
أحزاب الله وعقيدة بوش وبزوغ الديمقراطية الإسلامية هي مقالة مميزة دفعت الصحفي الاستقصائي الأمريكي المتمرس كان سيلفرستين إلى الاستقالة من صحيفة اللوس أنجلوس تايمز، فبعد مواجهته عقبات مستعصية فيما يتعلق بقرارات رئيس التحرير في الصحيفة بخصوص هذا المقال، أخيرا قرر كان اتخاذ حل بسحب المقال من النشر عوضا عن تعديل المعلومات التي سردها وبمغادرة الصحيفة. فما الذي يقف وراء هذه القصة؟
First off, I don't even really remember what prompted me to come to Lebanon. I had friends who, some had worked for the CIA and others were just eccentric thinkers who had friends here. And I'm sure they told me about what an interesting story it would be. But I can't remember exactly the origin of the story. But I know that even before I arrived here, and then I also went to Egypt afterward to talk with senior officials from the Muslim Brotherhood and just people on the street. I knew that I was going to find things different than what I believed. I had done a lot of research, so I was prepared. But I still knew I've never been to Lebanon.
Or to the southern suburbs of Beirut, or to the south of Lebanon, where Hezbollah people, community, and followers are.
Right.
Supporters.
I felt safe here always. I feel like it's home here.
But why did you have to quit the LA Times, Ken?
Well, I wrote a story about how people had misperceptions about Islam and political Islam. But the big problem...
And certain political parties, you mean it?
Hamas, Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood. So, but the problem, I was able to write for the LA Times most of what I wanted to write. But there was one thing they wouldn't allow me to write, and that was that the Palestinian people have a legitimate grievance against Israel and Israelis because their land was stolen from them. But I believe that the best solution would be for there to be a single state where Palestinians and Jews and other people can live.
But why did you leave? Why did you quit? It's because of the single comma or the single word that they wanted to edit it, and that's
I
why
said
you
no.
left?
Because they wanted to change the meaning, which was the Palestinian land was stolen from them by Jewish people, by Israeli people, however you want to describe
By
them.
Zionists.
By Zionists,
Right.
yes.
Now, in an expose in 2007 titled "There Are Men in Washington," Ken Silverstein's of Harper's Magazine drew much attention. Why you went undercover. That's why when we talked earlier about you lying. As part of an investment group with business interests in Turkmenistan to find out what U.S. lobbyists do for dictators, raising a lot of questions about journalistic ethics. What's your take?
Well, it didn't raise any questions for me about journalism ethics. It apparently raised questions for other people who criticized me. Yes, I believe you should always tell the truth, except in certain circumstances. In your personal life, in your political life, in your professional life, sometimes it's necessary to omit information. Sometimes it's even necessary to lie. When I talk to people, I go undercover very infrequently. If I'm not undercover, I always tell people the truth or something close to the truth. I won't call someone who I'm going to write a very critical piece on and say, I think you're a horrible person. I tell them I'm writing a story and I want to hear what you have to say, and that people will almost always talk to me. However, I do believe there is a role for undercover journalism, going undercover and lying to people, making up your job. In this case, I said that I worked for, I believe, a Middle Eastern businessman whose name I would not reveal, and that I, this businessman had oil or gas interest in Turkmenistan and wanted to change the image of the regime. So I went to these very prominent, powerful lobbyists in Washington, approached them. It was pretty funny, actually. I told them I was from London, and so I got a British cell phone, and I would call them. I lied. It was hilarious, actually.
What about your accent?
I told them I was American, because I can't fake a British accent. I said I was American. I don't even remember what I told them. They were so stupid. They were so greedy. They believed I would pay them a lot of money, and they will do anything for money in Washington. Well, I won't, but a lot of reporters or lobbyists or politicians will.
How dangerous was it for you, Ken, to do this?
I don't think it was dangerous at all. My favorite part of it, though, was calling people from a British cell phone. It rang 44 when I was sitting in my home in Washington, D.C., and these greedy people believed that I was calling from London. I was always afraid, in different countries, the ambulance makes a different noise. In London, it's very different than the noise it makes in America, in the United States. So I was always afraid an ambulance would drive by and give me away.
And it will just unveil what's happening.
Exactly.
Now, what were the comments and reviews by your fellow journalists concerning what you have done?
Well,
and the way you did it?
Even friends of mine, some friends of mine were critical. And that's fine. I'm still friends with some of those people. Because I don't mind people criticizing me. I believe that you have to answer to one person, yourself, no one else.
Ken, as the author of several books of investigative reportage, the last of which is The Secret World of Oil, well, in this book you have attempted to unmask endemic corruption between oil companies and governments across the globe. I assume it's probably impossible to eliminate corruption from the oil business, right?
It's impossible to eliminate corruption because it's like telling a fish to eliminate water. It's part of the world that the oil companies and the governments operate in. You have, as you said, endemic corruption because oil is worth a lot of money. And in certain countries that aren't democratic, and even in countries that are democratic, like the United States or Norway or France, where it's not corrupt, and of course I'm joking, oil companies want access to oil, whether it's a Malaysian oil company or an American oil company or a French oil company or a Norwegian oil company. And to get it in a place like Equatorial Guinea, for example, which to me is one of the worst governments in the world, a brutal, ruthless dictatorship, you have to pay government people to get access to the oil. That doesn't excuse it. There's a way to get access, I think, without corrupting yourself, but the oil companies usually won't do that. They're willing to corrupt people in governments, and they corrupt themselves. But I would also say that I wrote about, the first chapter of the book is about a dear friend of mine named Ali Khalil, who I believe is Lebanese. And I have immense love and respect for Ali. And it was difficult to write about him. I wrote about him for Harper's Magazine, and then it became a chapter of the book because he's a dear friend. It's very hard to write about a dear friend because you can't write too nice and you can't write too, well, you could write too mean, but if it's a friend, then why would you do that? It was a balancing act. That was the scariest thing I've ever done as a journalist. I was never afraid in Kazakhstan or Equatorial Guinea or in Lebanon, but to write about a friend is very, very difficult. But Ellie never said anything to me about this story, but we're still friends. So Ellie never said a word to me, ever, about the article. I don't think we've ever discussed it. And it came out...
What did you write about him?
Well, I wrote honestly about him. I love Ellie. Ellie does... I don't even understand what Ellie does exactly. Ellie is an intermediary or a fixer, but that's not the term I would use. because fixer is not what Ellie does. Ellie is a charming, interesting man who brokers deals between oil companies and governments. I don't know how he does it. I honestly don't know. He's been accused of...
He's one of the names that you unveiled in your book.
Yes, in a sense, because he wasn't so well known.
In your journey through the sector's murkiest crevices, what caught your attention the most, Ken, through researching your book?
What caught my attention most was chapter 1.
More than anything else.
Ellie. Khalil.
Why?
Because he's complex and interesting and
In
fascinating.
what sense complex, you mean?
I don't understand. Ellie is not pure good or pure evil. To me, he's mostly good. I don't care what anybody else says. You know, I also wrote another story about a German for Harper's Magazine. It was in an earlier book. It was also for Harper's Magazine. It was a story about a German arms dealer named Ernst Werner Glatt, who for 40 years supplied weapons for the CIA. In secret operations. So for example, this is how complex the world is. He supplied weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua and to various other people, including, I believe, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And Ernst Glatt, to me, is like Eli Khalil, except he's more complicated. Ernst Glatt is dead. Rest in peace. He was married to a Jewish woman. He was raised in Germany. He was in Hitler Youth as a young man. And he remained very right-wing and nationalistic German. I met his whole family. Now, personally, I prefer Ellie. I don't think Ellie is that complicated.
Right. But Ken, oil is also a key part of foreign policy. One of your observations was that, quote, there have been more violations of the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by energy companies than by any other kind of business, including weapons trading.
And that's true. I'm not sure that's because oil is more corrupt than weapons. It may be that weapons as a commodity is even more protected by governments. It may be even more essential than oil in some ways. If you want to run an economy, you have to have oil.
Right.
It's essential. If you want to protect your land, you have to have weapons and oil. You need them both.
And water.
And water. That's true. So it may be that weapons or even water might be more sensitive than oil. It's hard to say.
Right. So the secret world of oil names names and exposes the brokers, the lobbyists, the fixers who profit from the misery of millions and the accelerating pollution of the planet. It's a must-read book. Ken Silverstein, veteran investigative reporter with The Vice and The New York Observer and formerly with Harper's and the Los Angeles Times. Many thanks indeed for joining us.
Shukran.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.